Now that we've discussed the data table variable, which is an in-memory data structure capable of holding rows and columns, I'd like to talk about how we can read and write Excel spreadsheets or workbooks with the help of a data table variable. Excel spreadsheets or workbooks are also data structures similar to the data table, but they are a physical file, again, holding structured data. And again, structured data just means a predictable, repeating data format representing items of a similar type. Maybe it's users or customers or orders. We'll be dealing with rows, which have indexes like 1, 2, 3. And by default, columns are labeled using alphabetical letters like A, B, C. And we reference the data in any given cell using a combination of the column plus the row. So A23 would be the data in column A, row 23, and so on. Your spreadsheet can have a header row right before where the data starts, and that would simply provide our column names like first name, last name, customer ID, and so on. Not every worksheet will have a header row that illustrates what's in each column. In this section, we'll learn some basic skills for Excel and workbooks. We'll have an overview of the available activities, and specifically we'll talk about the differences between Excel activities and the more generic worksheet activities. We'll take a look at how to read a worksheet into a data table variable. Then we'll talk about writing a data table variable into a worksheet. We'll have a look at appending to an existing worksheet from a data table variable. And finally, we'll look at how to read or write specific cell data. Excel and workbooks are a very important aspect of RPA, so let's jump into it and take a look. In this lecture, we'll have an overview of available activities, and we'll specifically talk about the difference between Excel and worksheet activities. To do this demo, I'll start with a new blank project, and I'll call it Worksheet Overview, saving in the usual place, C Development UiPath. Double-click to close up the ribbon, shrink this down to give us more space. And the first thing I'm going to do is go into Activities and grab an if block and drag that onto my canvas. This will allow me to compare and contrast Excel activities versus generic worksheet activities. If we click on the Activities panel and delete our filter term by clicking this X, we've got a list of activity categories that are expandable. The two nodes we'll be interested in for this section are under System, File, Workbook, and also App Integration, Excel, and we could also expand Table as well, but I'll mostly be focusing on the activities under this Excel node. The most important detail to be aware of between App Integration Excel versus System File Workbook is that this set of activities requires the Excel application to be installed on the machine where the robot is running, whereas System File Workbook activities can do work without Excel being present. The most critical activities we'll be talking about in this section are things like read range, write range, append range, and then notice we can read a cell or write a cell. And if we jump down here to System File Workbook, you notice we have read range, write range, append range, and then read cell and write cell. So you can see that we have essentially the same activities for both of these collections, but there are going to be slight differences in the way they work. So that's why I've dragged this if block onto my canvas so we can put the Excel activities on the left and the System File Workbook activities on the right, and look at the differences. So let's do that. I'll go into Activities and start with Excel, and I will grab Read Range and drop it on the left, and Write Range and drop it after that. And notice that creates a sequence. I'll jump down here to System File Workbook and grab Read Range and drop that on the right, and do the same thing with Write Range. Again, I've got a sequence with two activities in it on both sides. The most urgent difference that I want you to notice here is that on the Excel side, for both read range and write range, I have the ability to provide a sheet name, and that's really about it. You can see for write range, here's my data table output variable. If we jump over here and look at the System File Worksheet activities, you can see that each of these has an extra field to provide a path to the workbook, and the Excel side does not have that field. The reason why is because all of these Excel-related activities are expected to be used within an Excel application scope activity. So this is a very important distinction. What that means is I need to drag an Excel application scope into my robot, and notice we've got this do sequence in here. So what I've got to do is drag each of these things into that do sequence. And now notice I have a workbook path at the beginning of my Excel application scope. So for the Excel activities, I provide the workbook path once at the beginning of this Excel application scope activity, whereas with System File Workbook, I'm going to provide the workbook path on each activity. And that general rule is going to apply to all of the activities in App Integration Excel as compared to System File Workbook. All of these things are going to have a field for providing the workbook path, whereas all of these are expected to live within an Excel application scope. So looking a little bit more closely now at App Integration Excel, you can see that along with reading and writing our range and cells, we can do things like setting a range color, reading a cell formula, we can close the workbook, we could execute a macro that lives inside the Excel spreadsheet, whereas down here, in System File Workbook, we don't have any of those things. It's very basic stuff, reading and writing ranges, reading and writing cells, and then the ability to read a specific column. So that should give you a pretty good sense of what's possible when you're dealing with Excel workbooks or the more generic System File Workbook when Excel is not installed on the machine. In the next few lectures, we'll take a look at how to specifically use some of these activities to get work done. In this lecture, we'll talk about how to read a worksheet into a data table variable. I'll create a new blank project called Read Worksheet, save it in the usual spot, C Development UiPath, click on Create, and I'll jump into my Windows file system here, and I've got a directory called Robot Files in my C drive. You can put this anywhere you want. I'm going to right-click and select New Microsoft Excel Worksheet. I'll just rename this UiPath Demo Data and double-click to open it. I personally don't like having this ribbon staring me in the face, so I'll double-click on that to hide it. And here are the rows and columns I was describing in the overview video. This cell would be E1, this cell would be F4, and so on. So to demonstrate reading data, in row number 1 here, I'm going to add a header, and this will give us names for each of our columns. So I'll call this first name, last name, age, and email address. So you can see that this schema is similar to what we were working with in our data table lectures. And this header row simply describes the values that are going to be present in each of these columns. Depending upon the worksheet you're using, you may or may not have a header row like this. So here, I'll type in Brian Lamb 50 admin at whatisrpa.com, and we'll do our John Smith example, age 30, John at smith.com, and I'll just add one more. Sam Jones is 25, Sam at jones.com. So as you can see, we've got some structured data, and this might be a list of users or customers that we want the robot to interact with. Maybe they need to be entered into several different systems, or maybe we need to create invoices for them and email them out, stuff like that. So I'm going to give this worksheet a name down here by right-clicking here and saying rename, and I'll call this customers. Control S to save, and I'll close this up. So here inside our new Read Worksheet robot, I'll go into Activities, type in Flowchart, and click and drag a flowchart onto my canvas. And as a convention, I'll just rename this as the whole process. But of course, you can name that whatever you want. And as you know by now, we could be starting with a try-catch block, or a flowchart, or a sequence at our top level. Your choice. Another option that we could do here, if we wanted to use a flowchart at the top level, is we could use a try-catch for each of the important sub-processes. So in here, I'll grab a try catch, click and drag that onto the canvas, and I'll rename that as read customer info. I'll connect the two by hovering over start and dragging an arrow from this node to that node. Notice that we get an alert in the top right-hand corner that says that our catch or finally is expected. So that just means we need to double click in here and jump down to our catch section and click on add new catch. As you learned in the exception handling section, I'm just going to handle the generic exception and click here in the white space. And while you would normally do something more significant here to handle an error, I'm just going to grab a message box and drag that in and open my quotes and type alert user about the error, :space, jump to the end and add a plus. And then I'm going to copy this exception, paste it in, and use .message, which is the text message that comes along with that exception. That's just a quick way for us to satisfy the need to handle the exception in this try-catch block. I'll click back here on Add an Activity, and now we're ready to read our Excel worksheet. So much like we did in the overview video, I'll go into the Activities pane and make sure my search filter is not set. And since we're trying to use Excel, I will drill into the App Integration, Excel, and remember that I can't just straight away grab this read range. The expectation when I use any of these activities is that they will take place within an Excel application scope. So I'll click and drag that on first, and when I hover over this, it says there are some required activity arguments that are missing. So if we move over here into this Properties pane, let's take a look. The most important thing we need is this workbook path, and notice that's also available right here at the top of this activity block. We could also provide a password if this worksheet is password protected, and we have this visible checkbox, and if you check that, you will see the worksheet open up on the screen while it's being read and then automatically close. If you uncheck that checkbox, the robot will read it without ever opening it on the screen. I'll talk about these bottom two options in a future lecture. The first thing we'll attack is this workbook path, and remember that a best practice would be to store a path like this in UiPath Orchestrator so that if the path ever changes, you don't have to modify and republish your robot. You can simply change the value in Orchestrator and the robot will use the get asset activity to grab that file path and keep working as is. For now though, I'll just click on these three buttons to choose a path to my workbook if I don't expect it to change. So you may recall that I stored it in C robot files. So I'll put that path up there and hit return. And there it is. There's my UiPath demo data spreadsheet. So I will click on open to select that. Now you can see UiPath puts a string into this Excel application scope to reflect the worksheet it's going to open and work with. Now that we've told the robot which spreadsheet we want to work with, we've got to do something with it. And this sequence allows us to do a series of activities. What we're going to do is click on Activities and either type in the word range up here to filter all the ranges, or simply just go down here and grab read range and drag it in. So read range already knows which workbook it's going to read, but we still need to specify the name of the sheet that it's going to read. By default, we get Sheet 1 because that's the Microsoft Excel default name for Sheets. You may recall that we renamed that to Customers, so that's what we have to supply in this sheet name field. So I can either type it here, or I could have typed the same thing right here. When I click on this read range activity, you can see that it gives me an option to specify which range do I want to read. If you just leave this as an empty string, it's going to read all of the data in the customer's sheet. If for some reason you only wanted to read this much, what you would do is you would specify to start from B1, and then the robot would read any data starting at B1 and continue. If you only wanted to read these first two rows starting from B, you would use B1 as your starting point and D4 as your ending point. And to do that, you would either simply type in B1 here for that first scenario, or you would use a colon between them and type in B1 through D4 to accomplish that second scenario. I'm just going to leave this as an empty string so it reads my entire sheet. And down here, you've got this checkbox to either add headers or not. And that simply means that if it's checked, UiPath will take this first row and use that as names for the columns it creates automatically in the data table variable. If that's unchecked, this will actually end up as your first row of data. So since we do have a header row with column names, I'm going to leave that checked. And now this final very important thing is to specify which data table the contents of that sheet is going to be read into. So I'll click in here, right click, say create variable, and I'll just name this my customers and hit return. And when we jump down here into variables, we see that my customers is in fact already a data table, which is great. And its scope is this do sequence right here. More often than not, when you read in some data in a sub-process, you're going to want to use that data in future sub-processes of your robot. And what I mean by that, if we jump out here to main, you see that here we're reading the customer data in a try-catch block, and maybe I would add another try-catch block after this that says process customer data. So when I read that data in, if the scope remains in that do sequence, then I will not be able to see my data in this next try-catch called process customer data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the scope of my data to the whole process so that any activities inside the whole process will have access to that data. So let's do that now. Notice when I open variables with whole process selected, I don't see the my customers data table. When I click on read customer info, I still don't see it. When I double click on that and click on Excel application scope, I don't see it. Only when I finally click on the do sequence do I see that variable. So what I need to do is click on do and increase that scope all the way up to the whole process. Now when I'm out here in main and click on the whole process and click on variables, I can see the my customers data table. So that means it will be visible in any of these next activities I add after read customer info. So let's double click inside here and double check that everything is set up properly. We've got our Excel application scope. We're pointing at the right data file. We are using a read range for the customer's sheet, and we're going to read the entire sheet. We are going to include headers, and the output is going into the my customers data table. Great, let's run the robot and see if it works. Notice the robot ran with no errors, and in the output, we don't see anything interesting. But since you learned how to interact with data table variables in the previous section, we can very easily jump up to main here, add a new try-catch, drag that into our flowchart, connect the two, call this process customer data, double click inside here, add a new catch, handle the basic exception, click here, type and add a new message box into our main catch area. Label this alert the user. Again, type a problem occurred plus exception tab dot message. Jump back into our activity area. And what we're going to do now is click on activities, type in table, and down here in programming data table, you may recall that we have this for each row activity. I can click and drag that in here, and we'll rename this to examine the customers. We can either leave this as the default of for each row, or to be more specific, we can say for each customer in. And now since my customers data table variable is in scope, I can simply click in here and type in my and hit tab. So now we're going to be examining each customer, which is just a row in the my customers data table. What are we going to do inside the body? We will log a message, click and drag that in, and I'll rename this log the customer. What are we going to log? Open my double quotes, and I'll just type in current customer, colon space, jump to the end and add a plus. And now we're going to access the columns of each customer row. So I'll type in customer dot item, and I'll open my parentheses, open my quotes, type in first name, which was the name of one of my columns, and then dot toString. Click away and all the errors go away. And let's run the robot. Down here in the output, now you see that we have current customer Brian, John, Sam. So out here on main, we have read customer information, which consists of an Excel application scope and a read range, which goes into this My Customers data table. Then we processed the customer data by using a for each row and simply logging the first name column of each customer. Now, obviously, this just illustrates a basic pattern. Here in your process customer data, you would do something more significant, like creating an invoice or adding that customer to a couple of different web applications, and so on. So hopefully that helps you understand how we can use the read range activity in the context of a larger process. To do that same thing if Excel wasn't installed is fairly easy. And to demonstrate, I'll just double click on Read Customer Info. And inside here, I'll jump over to Activities and filter by range. And down here under System File Workbook, I'm going to grab this Read Range activity and drag it right underneath this Excel application scope right there. And that's going to cause a sequence to be created to wrap around both of these things. So I'll click and drag that in. Notice, like I said, we've got our container sequence, which contains both of these things. To skip over this, I'll right-click and say Disable Activity. You can also use Control-D for that. So now inside this sequence, we're going to skip over the Excel scope we did and use this instead. If we examine the Properties pane for this, you can see that we've got a range, a sheet name, and a workbook path, plus that same Add Headers checkbox and a data table output. So it should be fairly easy to understand that we can select and Control-C to copy this path out of our Excel application scope and simply paste it in right here. Or of course we could have used these three dots to navigate to it the way we did before. Here we'll change this to Customers just like we did before. And we have a sample range here that we don't need, so I'll select that and delete it. So now we're going to read the entire sheet instead of just a specified range. We'll leave the add headers checked, and now all we need to do is specify a data table. If you were doing this for the first time, you would right-click and say Create Variable, but we've already got a data table that we created before, so I'll just type in My and hit Tab to select My Customers. So now instead of using this Excel application scope with its read range to put data into that My Customers data table, we are only going to use this generic read range with the same file and sheet and range and output data table. So in theory, if I just run the robot again now, everything will work the same and we'll get the exact same output, which we did. In this video, we're going to talk about how to write a data table variable into a worksheet. So there's two ways I could demo this, the long way and the short way. The long way would be to use the skills that we learned in the data table section and use something like build data table to specify a new schema, and then use add data row to add data into that data table, and finally write that data table into a worksheet. The faster way to do it would be to reuse the existing data table variable we've already created by reading our customer info. Since it's faster, that's the approach I'll use to demonstrate writing a data table variable to a worksheet. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that arrow and delete it with my delete key and move this aside for now. And instead of doing all this formality with a try, catch, and whatnot, I'll just do it the quick and easy way out here in my flowchart. I'll jump into Activities, and it's important to remember that any Excel activity we do is going to need to take place in the context of an Excel application scope. So I will click and drag that onto my flowchart, and I'll rename that Write Customers to another sheet. And I'll hover over this and click and drag an arrow between them so that we will go from here and generate our data table variable and then write that here. So notice here in our Properties pane, we've got the workbook path and whether or not this process should be visible. Since I don't want to overwrite the first worksheet we read from, I'm going to supply a different workbook path here. So I'll double click in here and grab this first one we used, click on main to jump back out here, click on my Excel scope, and paste in workbook path. And I will change this to new customers.xls. And that's going to be in the same directory with the other one. What's important to understand here is if this file already exists, it will be overwritten with the new data, but if this file does not exist, UiPath will automatically create it. So we've specified our Excel application scope, which points at a certain file, and now we have to double click to view on that. And that gives us our sequence of things we want to do inside this new file. So of course, I'll jump into activities and type in range, and I will grab right range and drag that in here. And my right range activity has a subset of the fields here, or a full set of the fields over here in the properties pane like usual. So it's asking us which data table we want to write into this new file. As you recall, we've already got my customers, and it's in scope here. So I will simply click in here and type in my and hit tab. As you can see, it's giving us an option to provide a sheet name. So I will select over that, type in new customers for our sheet name, and we could start writing at any given cell, but I'm just going to leave this at A1 to start writing in the very top left of this new workbook. We have an option to specify whether we want to add our column names as the first row of the spreadsheet or not. So I'm going to click on this checkbox to add that, and that's really it. We're ready to run. Clicking back out here on main, what we're going to do is use this read range activity to read the rows out of the UiPath demo data XLS file into our my customers data table. And then we're going to write our customers to another Excel spreadsheet called new customers.xls. And you can see we're writing that same data table. So here in our file system, you can see we've got our starting file. Let's run the robot and see what happens. Notice that a new spreadsheet opened up in the background and wrote those rows. And when we examine our file system, we've got a new spreadsheet called new customers. If I double click on that and look at it, we've got the same data in it that we got from our original worksheet. Of course, doing this process using the more generic right range would be even easier than this because you wouldn't need to use this Excel application scope. You could simply drag the system file workbook right range in here, and you would specify the name of the new file, the worksheet, the starting cell, and the data table, and you'd be done. To demonstrate that we can overwrite an existing file, I'll double click inside here and click on my right range. And of course, I'm going to leave this as the same file name. But in this case, in case for some reason you didn't want that header row, I'll uncheck this and rerun the robot. Notice it opened in the background and wrote our file again. But this time when I open up new customers, you can see that we no longer have that first header row, but this fourth row is still there. What that means to us is that it overwrote those first three rows and left the data inside the file that was already there. So if you are going to take this approach of overwriting existing files, make sure that you first delete any existing data inside the file so you don't wind up with extraneous rows you weren't intending to have. In this video, we'll take a look at how to append information to a worksheet from a data table variable. In order to speed up this demo, I'm just going to keep using the same worksheets we've been using. And in the last video, we did a right range that had 3 rows in it. And you may recall that it didn't overwrite this fourth row that was present from the previous write. I'm going to go ahead and clear out this data by right-clicking and deleting all the rows. And I'm also going to delete this sheet 1 that came for free when this file was created by UiPath. So I'll Control S to save and close this one up. And now when we write and append, it's going to go into this existing file. So back here in our UiPath process, you may recall that we're reading some information in from one spreadsheet and writing it into another. I'm going to reuse this block, which is an Excel application scope. So I'll double click on that. And after this right range, I'll go into my activities under App Integration Excel. And this time I'm going to drag an append range right after this one. So this is a very easy demo. You can see all we're going to do is take that same data table and paste it here, and grab this same sheet name, paste it here, and that's really all we have to do. Now my expectation when I run the robot is that it's going to write our 3 rows in rows 2 through 4, and then it will write the same rows again in rows 5 through 7. For my write, I'm going to turn this add headers back on so we have our column names in the output file. So let's run the robot and see. The robot is done. And inside my new customers file, now you can see that I've got my header row in here, and I've got the rows once, and I've got the rows again. UiPath was smart enough to just append the new records after this existing third record. When we use append range, we don't really have a choice about which row to start on. UiPath makes that decision for us. Of course, we could have used the generic append range as well, but to do so, we would simply use this outside of an Excel application scope, the same way I've talked about previous examples. To wrap up our Excel and Workbooks Basic Skills section, let's read and write cell data. For this short demo, I'm going to reuse our read customer info block and write customer block because each one of these is using a different Excel file to do its work. Obviously, you can read and write cells within a single Excel file, and you could even do so across multiple tabs. But I'll assume you can figure out how to do that after I show you how to read a cell from one file and write into a cell in a different file. So I'll double click in here, and I'm going to right click to enable my initial Excel scope. And I'm going to right click to disable my generic read range. So in this first Excel block using the UiPath demo data file, all we were doing was reading a range. This time I'm going to read a cell here, and then we'll jump into this block and we will write a cell in this one. So let's prepare for this by doing a little bit of work in our Excel files. This is the one we're going to read from. So I'm going to create a new tab down here at the bottom just to prove that we can interact with different tabs. I'll rename this Input Data. And I will arbitrarily type in read this and then add a string here, some data to read. And this could be a string or percentage or currency or whatever you want. So clearly when we read this, we're going to be reading from cell D3. So I'm going to Control S and close that file up, and we're going to write a value into this new customers file. So I'll open that up and also create a new tab down here and rename this to write data. And in here I'll just type value from first sheet. And that's going to go into C8. So I'll Control S to save that. And we'll jump back into our robot. So back in main, inside read customer, inside of our Excel application scope, we've already read the range. And while we're there, I'll just type in cell. Under App Integration Excel, let's go ahead and read a cell. So I'll click and drag that after the read range. And notice it's asking us for the name of the sheet and the location of the cell. And of course, we're going to have to store that into some kind of a variable. So let's start here. I'll click on this, right click and say create variable. And I'm just going to name this value red and hit return. Now, as you know, we've got to go examine the scope of that because we just can't leave the scope set to this one block. We've got to be able to use it in the second block. So back down in here inside of the do block, I'll look at my variables and I need to make sure that I change this value red scope to the whole process. And that way the second block will be able to read it. As you recall, the sheet name was input data and the cell we're going to read is D3. So we'll close up our variables, select our read cell activity and change this sheet name either here or over here in the properties to input data. And we'll change our cell name either here or in the properties panel to D3. So now when we read that value from the input data sheet, cell D3, it's going to be stored in this value red variable so we can use it later in the robot. Now, of course, I'll jump over to main and jump into this Excel application scope, which just as a reminder would normally be a try-catch block like this to wrap up our sub-process. But I'll double click inside there, and after my append range, I'm going to write cell. So I'll click and drag that under my append range. And just like read cell, we've got to supply the sheet name and the range, and then a value that we want to write. And this could either be a literal string or the value from a variable that we've captured earlier. So as a reminder, that sheet name is going to be write data, and the cell is going to be C8. So either here or in the sheet name here, we'll type write data, and we'll supply the range, which is C8. The final thing we need to do is supply the value that we're going to write. And like I said, this could either be a string like this, or I could type in value red, which is the name of our variable. And since that variable type is generic, I'm going to remember to type in .toString here so that it will be written out as a string. That's it. Here inside of read customer, we're going to read a value from that Excel scope. And then inside write customers, we're going to write a value into a different Excel spreadsheet using a different Excel application scope. Let's run it and watch. So in the background, you saw 2 Excel sheets flash up. If we go and check the spreadsheets themselves, we shouldn't expect to see anything different in UiPath demo data because we haven't written anything there. But inside new customers, on the new customers tab, now we have 1, 2, 3 copies of our users, because when it did the write range, it wrote those 3, and we already had these 3 from the previous append attempt that we did. So now this third append added even more onto the end. On our write data tab, you can see that the value sum data to read that we captured from the first Excel spreadsheet has been written to the appropriate cell. So mission accomplished. We now know how to read data from a worksheet and put it into a data table, write a data table into a worksheet, append data to a worksheet, and read and write cell data. Actually, I decided I wanted to add one more skill to this basic series. Here we're going to read a range of Excel data, then we're going to modify that data table in memory because maybe we have some business logic that we need to apply to some immature input data. And then after we've modified it, we'll write it back to a new Excel file. And this could be used for cleaning up proprietary data, so you can hand off a copy with redacted fields. Or you could simply be taking some raw Excel data, applying some business rules, and then outputting a different Excel file that has more meaningful information on it that was derived from information in the raw Excel file. Let's dive in and take a look at what I'm talking about. I'm going to go ahead and delete this information from our output file, just so we have a fresh copy, and I'll Control S to save that. You may recall from our input file on the Customers tab, we've got first name, last name, age, and email address. And let's say that we want to have an Excel file that has this information, but instead of having actual ages, we want to have some kind of demographic classification like young or old. If you only had one file to do, it would be easy enough to just create a new column here and use some kind of Excel transformation to populate that new column's data. But let's say that you had 3,000 different spreadsheets like this, and you need to remove the age from all of them and provide that demographic column I was talking about. Excel doesn't have any kind of built-in mechanism that would allow you to add that column and do that transformation on 3,000 different files. So this is good work for a robot. So we've already got a robot that's reading the customer data into a data table and writing that data table into a different file. What I'm going to do is click on this arrow and hit delete and add one more sub-process in here, which again normally would be a try-catch to deal with any errors. But in this case, I'll just use a sequence. So I'll click and drag that onto my canvas and connect these up. And I'll just say transform customer data. So you can see that we're building up a business process here. So inside transform, we're going to take advantage of some of the database skills that we learned in the previous section. The first thing that I'm going to do inside my transform is to click on activities and type in table. And I want to interact with my data table. So I'm down here in programming data table, and you can see I've got this thing called add data column. And that'll be good because I actually want to provide an additional column of data, which is that demographic value that I was talking about earlier. So I'll click and drag that in here. And it's giving me 2 options for how to provide that column. It could be a data column object, which is a more advanced concept, or it could just be the name of the new column. Here I'll just use something generic. Instead of age, it'll be age band, which just means something like an age range. It's asking me which data table do I want to modify, and that's our My Customers, so I'll tab away from that. Now it's asking me what type of column do I want. I'm going to have a text value, so it'll be a string. I'll leave the null checkbox checked because I'm not super concerned about whether or not this data value is present. It's not an integer that we can auto-increment, so I will not check that. I'm not going to provide a default value. Max length of 100 is fine, and I don't care if it's unique or not. So now, the robot will create a new column when it gets to this activity block. Now we need to put data into that new column. So back in Activities under my data table, I will say for each row and click and drag that in. And again, I could leave this as row, or I could be more specific and just say for each customer in My Customers tab. What am I going to do? I'm going to type in here if and grab an if block. And if you wanted to get more sophisticated about this with more choices, you could use a switch. But I'm only going to differentiate between young and old. So what I'm going to say is if My Customer tab dot item open parentheses and open quotes age. So that's going to get me a value that represents the age of my customer. And I'm going to say if the age of my customer is greater than 40, then I'll do something, otherwise I'll do something else. So you get the idea of what we're trying to do here in the condition, but in order to actually achieve this, we need to introduce a new skill. And this is something I talk about in more detail in the RPA Tech Primer. This customer.item age is an object, and this is an integer. When we hover over this, it says there's a compiler error because it can't use this greater than operator on an object. So it's asking us to convert this into a number. There's two ways we can do that. We can use convert.toInt and either 16, 32, or 64. I would use 16 in this case, and then wrap this up with parentheses. The other way to do it is by using cint, and that would do the exact same thing. So if my age is greater than 40, I'll go into my activities, I'll grab an assign activity, and click and drag that in here. And I will take my current customer row dot item, and then open my parentheses, and open my quotes, and type in age band. And just so you can see that better, I'll jump over here and click on these three dots. So we're going to use this assign activity to update my current customer row in this loop. And I'm going to update the value of the age band column. Make sure that we close up our quotes there. Click OK. And for the value, I'm just going to use a literal string. And since the current customer is older than 40, I'll say old person. Then I'll Control-C and Control-V to paste that over here. And in this case, since the person is under 40, I will call this young person. So to summarize, inside our transform customer data block, we are adding a new column called age band. Then we are looping through each row of my customers and calling that a customer. And then we're evaluating, is that person over 40 based on the age column? And if they are, we'll put the words old person into age band. Or if they're younger, we'll put the word young person into age band. Pretty easy. Now, of course, after we've added that data to the new column, we're going to write our customers to another Excel spreadsheet. And as I mentioned, we didn't want to include the age column, which contains the actual age. So inside transform, we've added a new column, we've looped through and added data to that new column. So after this, what I want to do is go back into my data table and use remove data column. So I'll drag that in. And it's asking me again, which column name or index or column do I want to use? So I'll do it the easy way and just say we want to delete the age column from the My Customers data table. That's it. So now we'll have a new column with new data. We'll remove the age column, and then we'll write that modified data table to our output Excel spreadsheet. Let's run it and see if it works. So when we ran it, we're getting an error that says column age does not belong to a table, and it's coming from our if. So let's go see what we did wrong. I see it right away. And this is why it pays to be very detail-oriented when you're creating robots. If I control mouse wheel to zoom out a little bit, what we're going to see is that we have this for each row, and inside there we've got a sequence which has a body and our if statement, and it also has this remove data column. So what I accidentally did was dropped the remove column inside the context of our loop. So what it did is it did the first row and updated my new column, then it deleted my age column at the end of that loop and started over again on the next row. So of course when it got to the if on the second iteration, we had deleted that column so it couldn't continue. I should have been more careful when dragging that in to make sure that it didn't go inside the body of my for each loop. So I'm going to Control X this, and then click on my for each and zoom in a little bit, and scroll down to the bottom and make sure I paste it beneath that orange line. So now it's in the right place, and I'm going to Control X on that body, and then right click to delete this sequence because that's kind of extra, and then paste my body back in. So now I have for each row of customers, do my little if update here, and then after this loop is done, only then will we delete that column. So let's run the robot again and see what happens. So there we go, both sheets opened up and I saw some work being done. Let's examine our new customers. And on the new customers tab, notice exactly as expected, we have first name, last name, email address, and age band. And each of our people are appropriately categorized within their age band because this person was 50, which is greater than 40. And this person was 30, and this person was 25. Both of them are under 40. Mission accomplished. I hope you can see how that could be applied to more complex business processes.